today. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenter, Julie.
Thank you so much. Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to Conversations with Faculty, Assessing Student Accommodations and Accommodation Denial in Higher Education. I am Julie Ballinger. I'm with the Southwest ADA Center. I'm an affiliate with them. My contact information is on the first slide. I want to thank April for the opportunity of presenting to you all today. I go way, way, way back in independent living here in New Mexico. I even at one point in my career directed a center for independent living. I want to thank Sierra and Mary for working so hard on the technical side. Thank you so much. And Brooke, I want to thank you for being the monitor today and reading the questions for me and everything else you get to do. So my preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am female, blonde, well, mostly blonde. As I get older, it's not as blonde. I just want to point out my background. It's the center focus of my background is a beautiful oil painting of northern New Mexico, of grasses and mountains and adobe houses. And I just like to show it off because I love it so much. I have been in this gig forever, over 33 years I've been doing this. And what else? I think that's good enough. That's good enough. Now, because we are recording, bear with me, I'm simply going to read the disclaimer. The information herein is intended solely as informal guidance and is neither a determination of legal rights or responsibilities under the Act or any other law, nor binding on any agency with enforcement responsibility under the ADA or any other law. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go off camera while I train, and I'll come back on when I answer questions. All right, next slide, which is slide 2. Be aware of the ADA National Network, information, guidance, and training on not only the Americans with Disabilities Act, but other disability-related laws. There are 10 regional ADA centers throughout the nation. We are the Southwest ADA Center. We all comprise the ADA National Network. We serve New Mexico, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. Our office is located in Houston, Texas, and I am located here in New Mexico. So to contact your regional center, it's adata.org or call the 800 number and it will direct you to your regional center of 800-949-4232. As I think I said, we are federally funded. Next slide, slide 3. The Act is powerful in its simplicity. It will ensure that people with disabilities are given the basic guarantees for which they have worked so hard: independence, freedom of choice, control of their lives, and the opportunity to blend fully and equally into the rich mosaic of the American mainstream. President George Bush at the signing of the ADA in 1990. Next slide, which is slide 4. Federal legislation and higher education. I do tend to give quite a bit of technical assistance and training to higher education. And it's an interesting animal, to say the least. And in terms of accessibility in higher ed, I want to acknowledge that we've come a long ways, but we have a ways to go. And any of you who are involved in higher education, I think you know that. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. I think you all probably know that. If you receive federal funding, you cannot discriminate based on disability, and most, at least state and public universities, certainly receive federal funding. Higher education is also covered under Title II, State and Local Government, and Title III, Businesses and Nonprofits of Americans with Disabilities Act. The reason is that even though you may be going to a state university, they usually are registered as a nonprofit, but they really have an interesting marriage with Title II, state and local governments. So really Title II applies for public education and higher education. So what does that mean? Higher education programs must be accessible to and usable by people with disabilities, including learning online programs. Regarding campus housing, that's the Fair Housing Act comes into play, Section 504 comes into play, and ADA comes into play. So even though housing in the community, Section 504 and ADA most likely don't come into play, depending, the Fair Housing Act absolutely does. But for higher education and campus housing, dormitories, yes, all three of those laws come into play. Next, slide 5. I just want to point out what we're going to talk about today. There is a publication, and it's a guide that I have written that I hand out quite a bit. This guide will give potential and present students, advocates, and higher education professionals an organized, straightforward tool to use when engaging, educating, and resolving issues with faculty regarding academic disability-related accommodations. This guide absolutely can be shared with anyone and everyone, and there's the link to it on our website. Slide 6. So our training objective is going to sound pretty much what I just read, to give students and advocates and higher ed professionals that organized, straightforward tool when engaging education and resolving issues with departments and faculty regarding academic disability-related accommodations. Slide 7. So here's what's really interesting. I'm sure you all are familiar with the ADA Amendments Act. You know that we all had to get together and pass this act after the Supreme Court got a hold of the ADA and through several rulings really impeded who could seek protection under the ADA. So that's mainly what the ADA Amendments Act is about, is restoring the original intent of who can seek protection under the ADA. And yet, Congress added this section. Under Section 6 of Rules of Construction, what it says is it has fundamental alteration. Nothing in this act alters the provision of Section 302B2A, specifying that reasonable modifications in policies, practices, or procedures shall be required unless an entity can demonstrate that making such modifications in policies, practices, or procedures, including academic requirements in post-secondary education, would fundamentally alter the nature of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations involved. Woo. So this is a clear message. It's in the ADA. They stuck it in the Amendments Act that higher ed needs to be accessible. And it's a pretty high bar, and we're going to talk about that to show that if they are not accessible to a student, it better be because there's a fundamental alteration or an undue financial or administrative burden. Slide 8. So, therefore, an adjustment can only be denied if it can be shown that it will either fundamentally alter the class requirements or program, give the student an unfair advantage over other students, in other words, it exceeds equal access, or result in an undue financial and administrative burden. That's what has to be present to deny access to a student. Next, slide 9. So, The U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, OCR, this is what they have to say. Shift away from the approach where the Student Disability Services Office has the burden of convincing the particular academic department or instructor to provide the accommodation or modification. The ability of the Disabled Student Services Office to persuade an instructor or academic department to provide an adjustment and accommodation should not be the determining factor of whether the student is accorded an accommodation in which they are entitled. Slide 10. So if any of you are involved in higher ed, you'll see that this culture absolutely does exist, to where the student services, when they're in conflict, or the student, when they're in conflict with a department or with a particular instructor, there's this culture of convincing the department or the instructor. And that the schools absolutely need to move away from that culture and create what I'm going to be covering today. Now, before we get into that, before we get into how civil rights should be determined in the higher education setting, it's always just a good practice to start with a conversation that helps the instructor or the department understand the purpose of the needed accommodation, and help the disability service professional or the student understand the nature of the course or exam and how the accommodation fits within the specific context. So that's that informal conversation of, this is what I need, this is why I need it, this is how it fits in with the course or the exam. That doesn't work if conflict still exists. Slide 11. Then let's launch into what should be done. First, OCR says universities, colleges should have a clearly articulated written procedure for addressing such conflicts, including designation of an administrator with authority over the parties and responsibility to resolve accommodation disputes. That's an effective method for ensuring institutional compliance, higher education compliance with Section 504 and Title II. And yes, this procedure should be a formal procedure, because the educational institution has a real obligation to seek suitable means of reasonably accommodating a person with a disability and to submit a factual record indicating that it conscientiously carried out their legal obligation. That's pretty clear. That's pretty clear that higher ed need to do what they need to do. They need to put resources in to do what they need to do to make higher education accessible to and usable by students with various disabilities. Slide 12. So a good place to start, a good culture to develop within higher education, effectively framing to academic departments. Departments, instructors should have the understanding that a denial of an accommodation could mean a denial of civil rights, meaning that this is a very serious issue and that the instructor must be fully prepared to justify their decision to the student, and maybe even justify their decision to OCR, or maybe even the student's lawyer. The instructor must take an active role of denial rather than a passive one of just simply disagreeing with the college's disability services or the student. In other words, if there's a denial of an accommodation, is the denial defendable under Title II of the ADA, under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act? Slide 13. So how is this done? How do we figure out that the accommodation is okay or it can be denied? And this is where assessing student accommodation, an accommodation denial guide can come into play. You all have the link to this guide. It is perfectly okay if you are self-advocating, if you're advocating for someone else, if you are from Disability Access Services. It's perfectly fine to share this guide and sit down and go through it with the department or the instructor or whoever you need to sit down and go through it, even to go through it with Disability Access Services. So here's the analysis that an instructor should go through. What are the instructor's general class policies and process, and how does that affect equal access determinations? Do these policies include how each individual disabled student's access needs are determined and met? In other words, another way of saying this is design with access in mind. Don't design a class and then as an afterthought, it's like, oh, we have a student with a traumatic brain injury. Oh, or, oh, we have a student who's a wheelchair user, or we have a student with a psychiatric disability. Design the class with access in mind. And, you know, students can help with this. Disability Access Services can help with this. Where a lot of conflict occurs is that classes are designed without those of us with disabilities in mind. And of course, there's going to be barriers. And of course, then those barriers have to be addressed. Number 2, will or does the granted accommodation directly correlate with the student's disability or barriers? So if, let's say, for example, the student wants extra time on the test. Their disability is they have an amputation. Okay, so how does the disability correlate? How does the accommodation directly correlate with the student's disability? Well, you certainly don't want the instructor to kind of have a knee-jerk reaction or Disability Access Service and go, well, you have an amputee, your leg is amputated. What does that have to do with extended test time? The interactive process with the student is you may find out that actually the student lives with a great deal of physical pain that's related to the amputation. And to sit for any long period of time is just too much. And so, yes, the student may need extra time on the test to where they take part of the test. They're able to stand, to move around, to shift, or whatever they need to do so they can get through the test. So it's important that, yes, the accommodation is tied into the disability and the barriers, but explore. 3, what is Student Disability Services recommending and why? So a lot of times Access Services are recommending something that really should happen, but they come up against problems in the instructor or the department wanting to do that. How have these suggested accommodations or modifications been taken into consideration? So really, truly, the department or the instructor needs to, in their heart of hearts, mind of mind, soul of souls, what are they recommending and why? Let's talk about it. Slide 14. 4. What the class is designed to do and measure should be carefully examined. What knowledge is the professor teaching? What activities are being used to determine, measure the student's understanding, implementation, and expression of gained knowledge? So, for example, what is the test truly measuring? And how does the requested accommodation affect or not affect this measurement? If the test is measuring how fast you can do something, the test can certainly measure how fast you can do something. And the accommodation given to that student should hopefully allow them to be fast. And getting accommodation that actually stops the measurement of how fast someone can do something, well, then of course, that accommodation doesn't have to be given. For the most part, though, tests are measuring what do you know? How do you apply what you know? So looking at accommodations that removes the barrier for me as a student, for example, should allow that measurement of what I know and how to apply what I know. Number 5, does the requested accommodation lower the learning standards? If it does, exactly how does it? So as you can see, what I'm pushing for in this analysis is where the instructor or the department, they may say, no, we can't do that accommodation because you know what? It's going to lower the learning standards. You can't stop there. Why? What? What's happening? Explain this to me. When you go through that, actually, interestingly enough, solutions can be found to where there are accommodations that do not lower the learning standards. Slide 15. Number 6. Does the requested accommodation fundamentally alter the class requirement? If so, be very detailed in how this is the case. You know, in giving my technical assistance and training in higher ed settings, what I have found is there's just this culture of no many times. And let me explain that. Does the requested accommodation fundamentally alter the class requirements? The answer is no, we cannot do that accommodation because it will fundamentally alter the class requirement. And that's the end of the conversation. There's a period there. What needs to happen is, okay, give me lots of details on how this is the case. Why? Why? And explain it, explain it, explain it. Again, this can actually lead to solutions. Number 7, does the request give the student an unfair advantage over other students? And if so, exactly how? How does this unfair advantage come into play? So just know we're talking about an unfair advantage over other students. It can't just be that the accommodation gives the student equal access and removes the barriers, but that actually the accommodation in some way, and we want to know what that way is, actually exceeds equal access by giving an unfair edge. Slide 16. Number 8. Would the accommodation result in an undue financial or administrative burden? So we can't do the accommodation because it's an undue financial administrative burden. And if so, how? Be specific. Explain it to me. Keep in mind that the burden determination must involve the head of the college or his or her or their designee, after considering all resources available for use in the funding and operation of the service, program, or activity, and must be accommodated by a written statement of the reasons for reaching that conclusion. So claiming that we can't do this because it's an undue financial and administrative burden, it's a big deal. It's a big formal deal. And as you can see, people have to get involved, people with authority have to get involved, etc. Slide 17. All right. What other equal effective accommodations can be considered and provided that will offer equal access for the student if the instructor denies the requested accommodation? So very clearly, and I think we all know that if the initial accommodation is denied for defendable reasons, as we've been talking about, okay, what else can you do? What else? Number 10. Does the appeal process afford immediate opportunity for the student to have their petition addressed in a timely manner in order to prevent irreparable harm to the student if their appeal prevails? Well, it's higher ed. Classes continue. Classes roll on. And so if I am not afforded the accommodation that I think I should have, that I think does not fundamentally alter the class, does not give me an unfair advantage, actually removes, removes barriers to give me an equal opportunity to participate in that class. Yes, there absolutely should be a kind of speed dial appeal process so it can be resolved and I won't, as a student, have irreparable harm in terms of trying to gain my education. All right, that is the 10 analysis points. And as you can see, it just goes through this logical thinking process, response process, interactive process, either between disability access services and the instructor or department, between the student and the instructor, between the student and the disability access services, et cetera, wherever that conversation and with whoever that conversation needs to take place, this analysis gives that guide for people to come together and have that interactive process to come to barrier removal conclusions. Slide 18. So remember, an adjustment can only be denied if it can be shown that it will either fundamentally alter the class, requirements, or program, give the student an unfair advantage over other students, in other words, it exceeds equal access, or result in an undue financial and administrative burden. Slide 19. Now, before I open up for questions, there's just a few more points. Essential program requirements. Before a decision that a class or program requirement is essential, the request should be carefully reviewed, adhering to specific procedural guidelines that includes debate about the nature and fundamental requirements of a particular class or program, subjecting it to substantial review. You would think higher education does this with their classes on a periodic basis, but I have found that's not really necessarily true. And so if the conversation of barrier removal involves essential requirements, then whatever that program or class, that essential program, or class requirement Is it truly essential? Maybe, or it may be even outdated. Slide 20. Class substitution. Let's talk about class substitution. Consider a class substitution or waiver consideration of a class substitution or waiver should be taken into serious consideration by the higher ed entity, barring fundamental alteration if no academic accommodation can be given. If you want to be a journalist, but you have severe learning disabilities that mainly manifest in mathematics, and it most likely manifests in other areas of your life, but for this situation, you want to be a journalist and your learning disabilities really show up in mathematics. There's no way to accommodate that student to where they can meet all of their mathematic requirements. I really challenge higher ed to think about that. Are you really going to deny the student to become a journalist, to be able to be educated, to be able to move forward in life, to be able to be employed, to be able to have financial security, to able to meet their dreams of becoming a journalist because of the philosophy that when someone graduates from my institution, they have what's termed a whole or well-rounded education. I totally get that concept. OCR totally gets that concept, but it's to get higher education universities and colleges to think about, do I really want to say no to a student who can succeed in the program that they want to be in, who can get their 2-year degree, their 4-year degree, etc. But I stop them. I stop them from getting it because I can't say that their education was well-rounded. Some answers. Does the college hopefully have a broad suite of courses to choose from to steer the students so that they can have that well-rounded education? So if mathematics is, not going to happen, or some of the mathematics is not going to happen, what can happen? What can that student do so that the university can say, yes, we gave that student a well-rounded education? Slide 21. Keep in mind, future requirements. This is very important. A denial of accommodation cannot be justified based on the instructor's personal doubts about the student's ability to meet future requirements of the degree or the profession. It is the here and now. Can the students in this class here and now meet the requirement? Students take classes for many reasons, and not all of them are necessary to even complete a degree. So you can't predict the future. If I'm in the program, I qualified, I'm in the program, I'm in that degree, I'm taking my classes, accommodations have to be based on the class I'm taking right now. Not, well, if we give you accommodation in this class, that accommodation is not going to work in 2 years down in this class. That's prohibited. It's the here and now. So the denial or approval of an accommodation should be based on the present class or program requirements only. I just want you to note that HEAD, and we're going to talk about HEAD in a minute, has excellent training materials on this very subject. 22. So if there's a denial of an accommodation, if the student believes in the end that the college is making an unjust decision of a denial, then Disabled Student Services has the role of informing the student of their right to appeal and to file with OCR. Hopefully, higher ed has a grievance process. Under Title II of the ADA, they are required to have a grievance process, an ADA grievance process. Again, it should be a process that's quick in many ways so that irreparable harm doesn't happen to the student because classes march on. So to prevent that irreparable harm, there should be those procedures in place. And yes, the school absolutely has a legal obligation to inform the student that they can appeal. Also, having this type of procedures can help in reducing formal grievance filing with OCR or the student just going out and getting their own lawyer. 23. Disability complaints. This is where they can go in terms of OCR for Section 504, etc. I'm not going to take the time to go through this. I just wanted it there so that people know where they can go to find OCR and file a complaint. Do keep in mind if a student is dissatisfied with the outcome of college grievance procedures and they do want that alternative, yes, OCR, or you can directly file in court. You can go directly in court. 24. Resources, 25. Again, there's the National ADA Network. Just go to adata.org to find yours. And if you call that 800 number, you will get your regional ADA center. Slide 26. AHEAD. AHEAD is a good resource, the Association on Higher Education and Disability. And there may be those of you on the training today that you're AHEAD members. You're very familiar with AHEAD. They're good. They're good. They're nationwide. I think they may even be international to some extent. And they do truly offer unparalleled member experience. Anybody and everybody can become a member. They have different membership options. I just want to point out that they do have a student membership option that's not very expensive at all. They are worth it, in my opinion. If you are going to go to college, if you are in college, if you are a professional member in the higher ed profession, AHEAD is basically the resource for you. Okay, that actually concludes my presentation, and I'm ready for questions or comments or whatever y'all would like to offer.
All right, we do have a few questions, and just a reminder, if you have questions, you can drop them in the Q&A and Julie will answer them, hopefully. So the first question we have is from Mary, and it says, person first, why is it addressed, quote, the ability of a disabled student instead of, quote, the ability of a student with a disability?
Because that's OCR's wording. So if you want a direct quote from the Office of Civil Rights, that's their wording. But it doesn't diminish in any way, shape, or form what it's saying. And what it's saying is that students in the higher education setting absolutely have civil rights, and those civil rights need to be honored. And when they're not honored, the understanding has to be that you are denying someone their civil rights. And so that's why through my years of providing technical assistance to higher ed, I created this analysis process.
All right, the next question comes from Rob. What role do you think collaborative and social emotional learning, CASEL, plays in self-management, social management, and responsible decision-making higher ed accommodation situations?
So I'm actually not familiar with CASEL, but if I understand, and let me know, Rob, if I'm not getting this, is in terms of, well, actually, I'm not sure what you are asking. What I think you're asking is student responsibility and supports in terms of social and emotional. So if you want to tell me more, I would love to hear it.
He did say yes, so.
Okay, so yeah, student as with any of us with disabilities in claiming our civil rights in our communities, whether it's education, employment, government services, getting services from nonprofits or doing business with a company. Yeah, we do have adult responsibilities to kind of hold up our end of the bargain, so to speak. What's interesting about the ADA is the ADA is I get to do what you get to do most of the time, but not always. That's the ADA, unfortunately, but it is. It was the compromise in which to get the ADA passed. And so there are responsibilities that come forward. A student in higher ed, if they need accommodations, they have to do procedures. They have to go to disability access services, etc. They have to make sure and give feedback to the appropriate person, whether it's disability access services and or the instructor. The accommodation is not working or it's partially working. So yeah, they have to be part of that interactive process in which they're part of making sure the barriers are removed for them in the higher education setting. So I'm not really sure I'm answering your question. And if I'm not, let me know.
All right, it looks like Evan added some information in the chat in regards to the collaborative for academic, social, and emotional learning. And I'm just going to read it. Is an organization that advances the development of academic, social, and emotional competence for all students. Their mission is to help make evidence-based social and emotional learning an integral part of education from preschool through high school. Through research, practice, and policy, CASEL collaborates to ensure all students become knowledgeable, responsible, caring, and contributing members of society. Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning is headquartered in Chicago, Illinois. So there's some more information about CASEL.
Thank you for sharing that. That is fabulous, fabulous. And what it sounds like to me, you know, we have equal opportunity and then we have equity. And what I would like to eventually see happen is equity. Equal opportunity gives you that equal opportunity to participate, but if you have other factors happening in your life, if you're a person of color, if you're gay, if you're female, if you're transgender, you also have other barriers that you could be facing. If you are socioeconomically poor, and so this sounds like a help of a step up towards much more towards equity of me being able to participate in my educational experience rather than me just going into higher ed and saying, okay, what do you need in barrier removal? So this is fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing it.
All right, the next question comes from Andy. It said, would this also apply to if you are going to a university, then college? So it would apply to all higher ed settings, correct?
what this applies to is a higher ed setting that is covered by Title II, state and local government, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. If you're talking about a private college, they fall and they don't get any federal funding, they don't get any state funding, they are a private college. So they fall under what's called Title III, public accommodations of the ADA. Title III are businesses and nonprofits. They do need to go through this analysis, yes, they do. But just keep in mind that their undue burden is a much lower bar to meet. So providing effective communication is a lower bar, etc. When a university is covered under Title II of the ADA, it has to offer what's called program access. Program access is a very high bar. Why? Because it's state and local government. They run on tax funds. And so program access is a very, very high bar in which they must meet. And this analysis helps them meet that high bar. This analysis absolutely can be applied to private colleges that don't get state, federal, local funding from governments at all. But just keep in mind that their claim of undue burden or fundamental alteration is just, it's not as stringent. I hope I answered the question.
Okay, she said thanks in the chat, so I'm thinking you did get the answer. Okay, so the next question comes from Gavin. If a student doesn't receive their diagnosis until they enter into college, what would be the best course of action or systems change could help direct these students to understand their access to accommodations?
So the student is coming out of high school, or they're an adult and they want to go into higher ed, and they know their disabilities, but that's not formalized through documentation. And so,
sometimes people don't receive a diagnosis until they're in their early adult years. So
right, exactly. And they don't receive it because they don't need to. But yes, when they enter higher education institutes, the Office of Civil Rights, the U.S. Department of Ed, OCR, they do, as you well know, they do allow the college to collect medical documentation that's actually a little more extensive than any other setting under the ADA. It's interesting, but it's a reality. And so a couple of things there. They're entering higher ed. Student access services is waiting for the medical documentation. That does not mean that higher ed can just sit back. What it means is that the higher ed is just waiting for the documentation. What needs to happen for the student when they enter into the institution is to go to Disability Access Services and start that interactive process. You're an adult now, whether you're 18 or you're 40, you know yourself, you know your disabilities. And so that interactive process should start pretty immediately while waiting on the medical documentation. If the higher ed institute is putting off that interactive process until after they get the documentation, that's a problem. That's a real problem. They shouldn't be doing that, to be quite frank with you. And so Disability Access Services should be interacting with you from the get-go. You're telling them about yourself. They're telling you what to expect in college. When they're telling you what to expect in college, then you're thinking about, okay, well then this is where I think I'm going to be facing some barriers. And so what is your suggestion for barrier removal, Disability Access Service? I have some suggestions for it. Educate me how this all works, Disability Access Services. That's what should be going on pretty much immediately. And then as the medical documentation rolls in, then it supplements what's already going on. Did I answer the question?
I believe so. And we had one of the participants, Masha, add to the chat, be your own advocate. And
right. And thank you. That's a phrase I should have used, that if this is not happening for you, if the college is saying to you, we can't talk to you until we have the complete medical documentation, yes, you have to be your own advocate. Absolutely you do, because that's not okay. That process needs to start pretty quickly, especially if for some reason there's a delay in receiving that documentation. For whatever reason, and that happens, real life happens, and there can be delays in the college receiving that documentation. It does not let the college off the hook to progress with you in removing barriers. Now, let's say that they give you extra time on testing, etc. Let's say that's an accommodation given, and you start a class, and that's happening for you. Your documentation slowly comes in, and it's a question of whether you need that extra time. Okay, that can be examined at that point in time. But they can't say, well, we're not doing anything for you, even though classes are starting. We have to wait for that documentation. No.
Gavin also responded in chat, yes, thank you. It is important for the medical provider at the university who provided the diagnosis should be responsible for educating the student on disability services. So I think sometimes it's just knowing what resources are even available.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Brooke, is knowing what resources are available. The disability access services, they really are the primary folks that should be educating the student on how all of this works. That's why that's one of the reasons they're there. In some ways, they can even advocate on your behalf. This is one of the reasons I did the analysis, the 10-point analysis. It gives them a tool to go advocate when they have a professor that says no. And they say, well, we can't stop there, so let's sit down and have a 10-point talk, etc. Some universities have enough resources where you can get your diagnosis from someone at the university. Others do not, and you have to go outside and get your documentation, etc. So yeah, it is important to be familiar with the college that you're going to attend, that you are attending, and what they do and don't offer.
All right, we have a few minutes left, so I'm thinking I'm going to read one that isn't really a question, and then we'll do the final question. So a comment, more of a comment from Masha. I just wanted to say thank you for your presentation. I am currently in my junior year at the University of Wyoming, and I definitely have had some interesting conversations with students and staff, and people need to be more aware of these things.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
And then the last question, and if there are questions we didn't get to, we will send them to Julie and hopefully post some responses. So this question comes from an anonymous attendee. When a college uses inaccessible to people using screen readers or Braille is the issue and not up to the individual instructor, what would you suggest?
I'm sorry, can you read that to me again?
It says, I just missed it. When a college uses,
So sorry.
It's okay. So when a college, I'm gonna kind of change some of the wording. When a college practices are inaccessible to people using screen readers or Braille, and that is the issue, and it's not up to the individual instructor, what would you suggest?
Well, what's interesting about that question is it's not up to the individual instructor. If the student reads Braille and has a screen reader and needs school materials accessible in that manner, the school simply should just be doing it. And it actually shouldn't be left up to the individual instructor to decide whether that happens or not. This is an all-encompassing accommodation that encompasses all classes, all studies, etc. And so the need for accessible materials so that screen reader can be used, screen readers software should be provided. In terms of materials in Braille, the school has an effective communication obligation under Title II of the ADA. What that basically means is that the communication that the student has with the material, with the instructors or whoever is indeed effective for them. And so I have seen, there have been compromises that not everything comes in Braille, but they make it accessible to the screen reader, et cetera, et cetera. That's that interactive process of figuring out effective communication. So that kind of accommodation is what I call an umbrella accommodation. And disability access services should actually be the one that makes sure that that happens across the board in someone's education. So I hope I answered that.
I think so.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. It is just a minute before the top of the hour. I do want to remind everyone, thanks for joining us. Thank you, Julie, for your presentation. And hopefully you guys can take the evaluation for this breakout. We really use that information to build upon future conferences. So I did put the link in the chat. It will automatically pop up when this ends. And you can also find it through the website. So thank you.
Brooke, before we sign off, I just want to say that if I didn't answer the questions the way that you had hoped I would, or you have additional questions, you do have my contact information on the first slide. So don't hesitate, and don't hesitate to use your AD Center. Thank you, Brooke, for letting me inject that.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.